Little girls sometimes get lots of attention.
Yeah.
Did you ever feel like she got all the attention?
No, it was never an issue. I mean, it's just normal to me.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. Hope you're enjoying your weekend. In the previous analysis I said instead of looking at fragments, we need to try to look at this as a process. So consider this idea of attention. If we accept that John wasn't home very much, and we'd really need to ask him that and perhaps the housekeeper about that, but let's say we accept that, then we really have one parent left that has to raise these small children. And if we accept that Patsy became pretty focused on the pageants, but then on top of that, we add Patsy being diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer, that obviously preceded the pageants. Well, then the overall allocation of attention dissipates even more because Patsy is in hospital, she's sick, she's sleeping, she's unavailable to be a mother. Well, guess what? John is as well. So who is raising these kids? Now consider Patsy gets cancer in 1993 at the age of 36 when JonBenet is 3 and Burke is 6 and nearly dying, right? That had to have been traumatic for everyone, for John, for Burke, for JonBenet. But what about Patsy? What about what impact did her getting cancer have on Patsy? What kind of anxiety did that event bring into the family? And how did certain individuals deal with that anxiety, cope with anxiety? What did they do to soothe that anxiety? What did JonBenet do? What did John do? What did Burke do? What did JonBenet do? Think about how much Patsy had to lose. You know, she was part of this huge fairy tale. Dreams were coming true. You know, she was beautiful and living in the American dream, only for her health to fade. And so she was fighting to hold on to that. You know, also she was losing her looks. She was losing her hair. She was losing her life. Was there someone at her side helping her to battle this monster? And then when she finally emerges on the other side, bruised and battle scarred, but she comes out of it, her focus turns to JonBenet. She reaches the finish line of this terrible event, this terrible trauma. And what does she do once she gets there? Well, imagine if Patsy had literally returned from a war and Burke had been waiting for her return, you know, waiting to embrace her, waiting to give her a hug, only for his mother to return and then focus all of her attention on his sister. Now, think about the first was involuntary, you know, in terms of the attention. Patsy didn't really have a choice. You know, Patsy was ill. It's a stage 4 cancer. But the second, if it happened, was by choice. The second thing where you're not getting attention isn't because someone is sick. It's because they've made their choice. So don't compare how much attention you got as a child to Burke and JonBenet. Both these kids lost their mother completely for a period of a year or more when they were very young, you know, during this foundational phase in a child's life, when small children really do need their mothers. And what was happening to their mother was frightening. Patsy was fighting for her life. That is also something very scary to be dealt with at such a young age. And I think if there's anything more traumatic than losing a parent in divorce, it's losing one to death. And that was on the cards for a while. The one, though devastating, is a series of temporary absences. The other is a complete and total loss. What if somebody doesn't die and when they come back, they choose someone else over you? You love that person, but they come back and they, in a way, choose someone else. Is that what happened here? Is that what it felt like to someone here? Now let's get back to Judith Phillips. Judith Phillips describes seeing Burke after the incident and Burke saying to her, "Don't touch me." She describes him having a chip on his shoulder. If he did have a chip on his shoulder, how did it get there?
After the murder, I took my daughter, Lindsay, and myself, because Lindsay wanted to see Burke. And they opened the door and escorted me into the living room, and Patsy came in. I went to get my daughter, and there was Burke, and I walked up to him, and he said in this terse voice, "Get away from me. Don't touch me. Leave me alone."
If this anecdote is true, it could be that Burke associated Phillips with everything he didn't like about his mother and everything he didn't like about his sister. The pageants, in other words. When Judith pitched up, it meant another pageant was on the cards, another photo shoot, a lot of fussing about outfits, and him being totally irrelevant to that whole operation. It meant that he was a fifth wheel, either a nuisance or in the way. And maybe it left some sort of scar. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't.
I mean, it's just normal to me.
Now let's jump into 3 more shocking insights from the Ramsey photographer. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, there's a show on Netflix. Have you guys seen it? It's called American Manhunt, O.J. Simpson. It's been the #1 TV show on Netflix. At least it has been for the last couple of days. If you guys would like me to cover that, I have written 3 books on the O.J. Simpson case, and I also traveled to Brentwood. Let me know in the comments. If you find this analysis worthwhile, please hit the thanks button and let's get started. So, 3 shocking insights from the Ramsey photographer. A. Susan Stein was quote-unquote very threatening to Judith. One of the reasons the Ramsey case blew up the way it did was because of the sheer volume of photographs and footage surrounding this little girl. This was definitely not normal. The amounts of dressing up and performing and performances and just all this material, surrounding this little girl. And that's also what makes the lack of material around Christmas Day quite weird. It's also the same reason the Chris Watts case became as huge as it did, because his wife Shanann put the whole family on display on Facebook constantly. And so it gave one a real sense of becoming familiar with these people. And this is true of the Ramsey family as well. We feel like we know JonBenet. We've watched her grow up, in a sense. And one can't help thinking, if Judith Phillips was the family photographer, the tabloids had to be beating down her door for photos. And which photographer could resist the temptation to sell their photos? And of course, this is a bit of a moral conundrum. Judith may own the photos, but Patsy's her friend, so what does she do with them? And so Susan Stein was very unhappy about the situation, and this came up in this exclusive interview. Judith says, no, that was after the murder. She, meaning Susan Stein, and I were the only 2 from our softball team to have arrived early, and she was sitting there on the bleachers, and I said very reluctantly, "Hi, Susan," and she tore me apart by saying, "Why would I want to talk to you? You sold the pictures to the tabloids. You better get yourself a good," and that was the time she said, "You better get yourself a really good attorney." And she kept pointing her finger at me. "You better get yourself a really good attorney." And so Judith is asked, was Susan threatening? And Judith says, yes, very threatening. "We're going to come after you." And I just laughed and I said, "Susan, you don't know what you're talking about." And she said, "Oh, yes, I do. I do know what I'm talking about. It may take a year or 2, but we're going to come after you, and you better run and hide." Of course, now you've kind of got to wonder, what stake does Susan Stein have in this whole outcome? Why is Susan Stein so aggressive and so invested and so involved? Why, of all the friends, if you think about the Fernies, the Walkers, the Whites, why do the Steins behave in a kind of a different way? And this apparently happened in February or March. I think it's March 1997. And then Judith said, right. And when I read Jamison's website about that particular meeting, I knew it was full of Susan Stein's lies. It was pathetic. And so what you have is an extension of that. You have an online campaign taking place, and Susan Stein, certainly according to Judith's accusation, participating on this other website, which is organized Ramsey Apologia. And so what Judith is touching on here is this idea of an organized online campaign to put a counter narrative out there. And we know that Susan Stein herself got involved in an online campaign involving emails as well. Anyway, let's move on to B, Patsy's honesty. Remember I said that Patsy could just as easily have lied to Judith about the incident where Burke struck JonBenet with a golf club. Someone left a comment saying, well, there was no reason to lie because at that point nothing had happened to JonBenet. JonBenet was still alive. But Patsy's truthfulness, Patsy's honesty is definitely something worth looking into, because Judith mentions an instance where she felt she had caught Patsy out in a lie. Mame says, were you shocked? Obviously when you saw the bleached blonde hair. Judith says, yeah, I was shocked. That's why I asked Patsy, what did you do to JonBenet's hair? You didn't dye it, did you? And she said, no. It was hot. It was a hot summer sun in Charlevoix that dyed her hair, Mame, and it was obviously bleached. Judith, laughing, yes, it was obviously bleached. It was obviously bleached. I thought, how stupid do you think I am? I didn't respond, but I said, oh, isn't that interesting?
It's just normal to me.
Now, I do remember when I was researching one of my books, I was testing a theory. Firstly, that the golf strike incident happened in Charlevoix, and secondly, that it could have happened very close to JonBenet's birthday. Remember what I was saying about jealousy and gifts and things like that? And if Burke was jealous, when would that jealousy most likely be triggered? In other words, I was testing this idea, was it definitely an accident? Could it have been deliberate, right? And I can't remember now what I found out one way or the other, but it is an interesting psychological rabbit hole to explore, wouldn't you say? Perhaps it's something we could revisit. Now let's go to number 3, Patsy in 1993. This incident, revealed by Judith Phillips, lends a little credence to the theory that Patsy had a temper and could lash out. Although I tend to agree, that if there were things that upset Patsy, I think there could have been, but I'm not sure if bedwetting really was one of them. Anyway, Mame says, JonBenet had a bob? Judith, a real short one. And I said to Patsy, what happened to her hair? And she goes, oh, I just got so sick of fighting with JonBenet about combing her hair. We would fight all the time, so I just got sick of it, and I took the scissors and cut her hair. And Judith laughs. And this kind of comment does give you a sense that these are women who are good friends, that they can talk in a familiar way with one another. And so Mame says, oh, Patsy cut JonBenet's hair herself. Judith, yeah. Mame, how old was she? About 3. And Judith says, yeah, she was about 3. And shortly afterward, I did the photo shoot for the Colorado Women's News article and spent some time in the home. And JonBenet still had that short bob of haircut. She reminded me of a little girl who had some tomboy qualities to her. As I searched around the house for a lighting situation of where I was going to take these pictures of Patsy and then the children, she would follow secretly behind. I would hear some noise and I'd turn around and there was JonBenet. Interestingly, in August 1998, after the police presentation and during that limbo period when the DA Alex Hunter was vacillating about calling a grand jury, Judith Phillips was one of the 3 ex-Ramsey friends who wrote an open letter calling for a special prosecutor to be assigned to the Ramsey case. In her letter, Judith Phillips accused DA Hunter directly of obstructing justice in the Ramsey case. She wrote that she was asserting that Mr. Hunter was willing to obstruct the justice he swore to uphold. Guess where the DA was at the time these letters were circulating, at the time the community were in uproar about the case going nowhere slowly? Well, he was vacationing in Alaska. When everyone was trying to bring this case home, the DA was in Alaska. Perhaps in an effort to exert even more pressure on the DA, it was during this impasse that 2 Denver newspapers leaked news for the first time of Burke's voice in a recording in the 911 call, which was something that raised serious doubts on the Ramsey's versions of events at that point in time. This is from the New York Times, dated August 1998. Yesterday, Denver's 2 newspapers published articles that appeared to opened a window in the Ramsey household in the early morning of December 26, 1996. According to these reports, Mrs. Ramsey failed to hang up the telephone for a few moments after calling 911 to say that she had discovered a ransom note. A California lab reportedly digitally enhanced snippets of the conversation picked up at 5:52 a.m. from the Ramsey kitchen. Now, I've always said I believe that that call was actually made from the basement because you can't miscradle a phone that's a wall phone. Or it's certainly much easier to miscradle a phone that is lying flat on a table. The article goes on to note, according to the newspaper accounts, Mrs. Ramsey can be heard screaming, and JonBenet's 10-year-old brother, well, at that point he was 9, he was a couple of weeks away from being 10, can be heard asking what she found. Mr. Ramsey can be heard telling his son to go back to bed. The Ramseys have said their son was asleep in bed when Mrs. Ramsey found the note and called 911. Now, you can imagine if Burke, whatever his involvement or lack of involvement in this case, if he overheard the 911 call and Patsy's talking about a note, there's a ransom note here, it says SBTC. When Patsy put the phone down, you could imagine Burke saying, "What was that? What did you find?" Now, naturally, we could be wrong about the whole thing, about this whole idea of Burke feeling left out. And yet, if you think about the crime scene, what role, by hook or by crook, does Burke play in it? Even though JonBenet is deceased, we seem to see and think about and imagine her constantly, while Burke is relegated to a complete non-entity in this story. He's either asleep or he's not even in the house when everyone else is. And even beyond that, he doesn't know anything, is not even worth talking to. Burke disappears only for him to emerge as someone who turns out not only to be not incidental to this case, but not nearly as irrelevant as he seems to be at first. Instead, he emerges as a vital witness that even the grand jury want to talk to. The grand jury want to talk to him. They don't even want to talk to Patsy and John. And the recording of his voice and that high-tech shoe print in the wine cellar seem to bear this out. Also, his fingerprints on the bowl of pineapple. What does he know about that? And this is what the grand jury ask him about when he's on the stand, and he tells them, well, it did sound like his voice. Judith Phillips also made an interesting comment about the Ramseys going on CNN the way they did. Consider the inversion. The Ramseys talking to the media. Remember, Judith and other Ramsey friends remained silent, didn't talk to the media, but they did talk to the police. And if you think about that, why would it be helpful in a situation where a killer is on the loose and they're trying to find JonBenet's killer, that why shouldn't the Ramseys' friends not speak to the police or the media? I mean, that's a very important point as well, that the Ramseys didn't seem to want their friends to speak to the police either. And so Judith said in this article from The Sun, to me it seemed odd that they would give a big television interview but not work with the police. If the Ramseys' friends didn't talk to the media and the Ramseys did, and they gave press conferences, what ultimately was the result? Well, wasn't it that someone controlled the narrative and someone didn't?
Did you go to the pageants very much?
Yeah. I mean, I remember like one of the pageant things or something, she just would go out and just flaunt whatever on stage, and she wasn't shy, I guess.
Right. Did you feel left out of that, or was that okay with you?
I'm not going to take it further than that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.